When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. I packed my bags quietly that Tuesday morning. The rain was tapping against the window, soft and steady, like it was keeping a secret it didn't want to tell. I folded my sweaters one by one, the same sweaters my husband used to say made me look like a grandmother from a storybook. I wondered if he could see me now, from wherever he was. I wondered if he was ashamed. 50 years I had lived in that house. 50 years of birthdays and Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings. 50 years of sweeping the same floors, washing the same windows, watching the seasons change through the same kitchen window where I once stood with my mother-in-law and learned how to roll dough for pie crusts. She told me then, "Margaret, marriage isn't about loving the same person every day. It's about loving the same house, the same memories, the same life you built together." I didn't understand her then. I was 22 and in love, and I thought love was the only thing that mattered. Now I know better. Now I know that love can live inside floorboards and porch swings and the crack in the driveway where the children used to ride their bicycles. Now I know that love can be packed into cardboard boxes and carried out to a car that smells like someone else's life. Now I know that love can look at you from across a funeral parlor, wearing black and holding a handkerchief, and pretend you never existed at all. My son stood at the door when I left. He didn't help me carry my bags. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, looking anywhere but at me. I wanted to touch his face one last time. I wanted to remind him that I was the one who stayed up for 3 nights straight when he had chicken pox, that I was the one who drove him to college and pretended not to cry when he walked through the dormitory doors, that I was the one who held him when he was 4 years old and afraid of the dark, and he whispered to me, "Mommy, will you always be here?" But I didn't say any of that. I said, "Take care of yourself, sweetheart." And I walked out the door. The funeral was 3 days later. My mother-in-law's funeral. The woman who had never quite approved of me, who had never quite forgiven me for marrying her only son, who had spent 37 years treating me like a guest in my own family. I stood in the back of the church, wearing black like everyone else, and I watched them act like the perfect grandparents. They stood at the casket and wept. They held each other and whispered about how much they would miss her. They told stories about her kindness, her generosity, her gentle hands. And I stood there, invisible, remembering the truth. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. This is the story of a woman who spent her whole life trying to earn a place at a table where she was never welcome. This is the story of what happens when the funeral ends, the flowers wilt, and the family goes home, and you're left standing alone with nothing but the truth. This is the story of how my grandparents-in-law broke my heart, how their grandson let them, and how I finally found the courage to stop pretending. My name is Margaret. I'm 73 years old now, and I've lived long enough to know that memory is not a photograph. Memory is water. It shifts and flows and changes shape depending on the vessel you pour it into. Some people remember their grandparents as saints, their childhoods as golden, their families as perfect photographs hanging on a wall. Other people remember the spaces between the photographs, the empty chairs, the unspoken words. The love that was given to everyone else, but never quite made its way to them. I married Daniel when I was 22 years old. He was 24, fresh out of law school, with a smile that made the whole room feel warmer and a laugh that sounded like summer thunderstorms. His parents, Walter and Alina, were the kind of people who looked at you and measured you. I felt their eyes on me from the very first Sunday dinner, weighing and measuring and finding me lacking. Walter was tall and quiet. He had been a banker, then a bank manager, then retired early with a pension and a collection of antique clocks that chimed at different times throughout the house. He was not unkind to me exactly. He was just absent. He looked through me the way you look through a window you've passed 1,000 times. I was there, but I wasn't part of the landscape. Not really. Alina was different. Alina was sharp and precise and never forgot a slight. She had been beautiful once, and she still carried herself like a woman who expected admiration. Her hair was always perfectly set, her nails always polished, her house always immaculate. She was the kind of grandmother who kept her good china behind glass doors and her candy dish filled with wrapped mints that no one was allowed to unwrap. She was the kind of grandmother who kissed her grandchildren on the forehead and said, "What a lovely child," in the same tone she might have used to compliment a neighbor's new drapes. Daniel was their only son. They had waited 10 years for him, after 3 miscarriages and a stillbirth that Alina never spoke of. He was their miracle, their golden child, the answer to prayers they had almost stopped praying. And he loved them. He loved them with the fierce, blind loyalty of a man who had never needed to question whether he was loved in return. I understood that. My own parents were quiet people, good people, but not demonstrative. We didn't say, "I love you" in my house. We showed love by showing up, by doing the dishes, by remembering to pick up milk on the way home. Daniel's family was different. They said, "I love you" at the end of every phone call. They hugged and kissed and held hands at the dinner table. They looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, all warm light and gentle smiles. But Norman Rockwell paintings are painted. They're not photographed. Someone chooses what to include and what to leave out. Someone decides where the light should fall and where the shadows should stay hidden. Our first child, Michael, was born 2 years after we married. I remember bringing him home from the hospital, that tiny bundle in his blue receiving blanket, his fingers curled around mine like he already knew I was the one who would protect him. Daniel called his mother from the hospital room, his voice breaking with joy, and I heard her say, "Oh, my darling boy. Now you know what real love feels like." Not congratulations, not "How is Margaret?" Not "I can't wait to meet my grandson." Now you know what real love feels like. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I told myself that new grandmothers were entitled to a little excitement, a little clumsiness with words. I held my son against my chest and breathed in the sweet, powdery smell of his skin and promised myself that I would never, ever let anyone make him feel like he wasn't enough. I didn't know then that the promise I made would be the promise I broke. Not because I stopped loving him, not because I stopped protecting him, but because there are some hurts you cannot protect your children from. There are some wounds that come from the very people who are supposed to love them. And by the time you realize what's happening, the damage is already done. Sarah was born 3 years later. She came into the world with a full head of dark hair and a cry that could shatter glass. She was fierce from the very beginning, my Sarah. She didn't want to be held, she wanted to be carried. She didn't want to be fed, she wanted to feed herself. She didn't want to be loved quietly, she wanted the world to know she was here. Alina came to the hospital this time. She brought flowers and a stuffed bear and held Sarah with practiced, careful hands. She said, "She has Daniel's eyes." She didn't mention that Sarah also had my stubborn chin, my long fingers, my habit of looking at people like she was trying to read their souls. She didn't mention me at all. Over the years, I learned to expect this. I learned to accept that Alina would never see me as anything more than the woman who married her son. I learned to smile at family gatherings and contribute to conversations about people I barely knew and pretend I didn't notice when the family photo albums skipped over the years I joined the family. I learned to be grateful for the small kindnesses. A birthday card signed in Walter's shaky handwriting. A Christmas gift that was always practical, always generic, always carefully chosen to avoid any implication that Alina actually knew who I was. But before we continue, I want to extend a very specially invitation to you: subscribe the channel and leave a like. This helps me see that you support me and enjoy my stories, and comment down below which city you are watching us from right now. Let's continue. Daniel didn't see it, or maybe he saw it and didn't know how to name it. His mother was his mother, and he loved her, and love has a way of smoothing over the rough edges until you can't feel them anymore. When I tried to talk to him about the way she looked through me, he said, "That's just how she is. She's shy." When I mentioned that she never asked about my work, my friends, my parents, he said, "She's old-fashioned. She doesn't know what to say." When I told him that she held Sarah for 2 hours at Thanksgiving dinner and never once offered to hold Michael, he said, "You're imagining things. You're too sensitive." Maybe I was. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was seeing slights where there were only thoughtless moments, indifference where there was only age and habit. I spent years asking myself these questions, turning them over in my mind like stones in a river. Was I the problem? Was I expecting too much? Was I asking Alina to be someone she wasn't capable of being? But then the grandchildren grew older, and the subtle distinctions became less subtle. And the questions I had been asking myself for 30 years finally found their answer. The answer was yes. I was the problem. I was the problem because I kept expecting fairness from people who had never learned how to be fair. I was the problem because I kept hopping for love from people who had never learned how to love anyone who didn't already love them first. I was the problem because I kept believing that if I was patient enough, kind enough, invisible enough, they would finally see me. They never saw me. And what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that they didn't see my children either. It started, as these things always start, with small moments that I tried to ignore. The first time I noticed something was wrong, Michael was 7 years old. We were at Alina and Walter's house for Easter Sunday, and the grandchildren were hunting eggs in the backyard. Sarah was 4, toddling through the grass with her pink basket, delighted by every plastic egg she found. Michael was older, more serious, methodically working his way across the lawn like it was a chess board. Alina stood on the porch, watching. I stood beside her, holding Sarah's sweater in case the afternoon turned cool. "Michael is so diligent," I said. "He takes after Daniel that way." Alina didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the far corner of the yard, where Daniel's sister's grandchildren were shrieking with laughter over a particularly well-hidden egg. "He's very bright," I continued, feeling the familiar need to fill the silence. "His teacher says he's reading at a 4th grade level." Alina turned to look at me. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were cool. "That's nice, dear." Then she walked down the porch steps and across the lawn to where her other grandchildren were playing. She crouched down and helped the youngest one open her plastic egg, revealing a chocolate coin wrapped in gold foil. The little girls squealed with delight. Alina laughed, actually laughed, and kissed the top of her head. I watched Michael watch them. He was standing alone in the middle of the lawn, his basket half full, his face carefully blank. He was 7 years old, and he had already learned how to hide his feelings. He had already learned that Grandma didn't look at him the way she looked at the others. He had already learned that there was something wrong with him, something he couldn't name or fix or understand. I walked across the grass and knelt beside him. "Look at all the eggs you found, sweetheart. You're doing such a good job." He looked at me. "Grandma didn't say hello to me today." "She was busy, honey. She'll say hello later." "She never says hello to me first." I opened my mouth to reassure him, to explain, to make it better. But I didn't have any words, because he was right, and I had been pretending otherwise for 7 years, and I didn't know how to keep pretending anymore. The years passed, the moments accumulated. When Michael won the spelling bee in 4th grade, Alina sent a card. It was a generic card with flowers on the front and a pre-printed message about celebrating your special day. She signed it, "Love, Grandma and Grandpa," in handwriting that was clearly Walter's. No personal note, no mention of the word proud. No acknowledgement that her grandson had stood on a stage in front of 300 people and spelled phenomenon correctly to win the championship. When Sarah took her first dance recital at age 6, Alina didn't come. She had a cold, she said. She didn't want to spread germs. Daniel's sister's grandchildren, the same grandchildren who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, were in the recital too, and Alina attended their performance the following weekend. I saw the photographs on Facebook. She was sitting in the front row, smiling. I didn't say anything. I had stopped saying anything by then. What was the point? Daniel would defend her. I would feel angry and guilty and ashamed of my anger. The cycle would repeat itself, and nothing would change. So I held my tongue and I smiled, and I pretended that my children didn't notice that their grandmother loved them less. But they noticed. Of course they noticed. One night, when Michael was 12, he came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He stood beside me for a long time without speaking, drying the plates I handed him and stacking them in the cupboard. "Mom," he said finally, "why doesn't Grandma like us?" I almost dropped the plate I was holding. "What? Michael, of course Grandma likes you. She loves you very much." "No, she doesn't." His voice was calm, matter of fact. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was stating a fact like the sky is blue or water is wet. She loves Sarah and David and Emily. She doesn't love me. Michael, that's not true. It's okay, Mom. He looked at me, and in his 12-year-old eyes, I saw a wisdom that broke my heart. I used to think it was because I did something wrong, but I don't think that anymore. I think she just doesn't know how to love people who aren't exactly like her. I put down the dish. I turned off the water. I took his face in my hands and I looked at him, my son, my firstborn, the boy who had taught me what it meant to be a mother. It's not your fault, I said. None of this is your fault. Do you understand me? He nodded. He didn't cry. He had stopped crying about his grandmother years ago. She's the one missing out, I said. She's missing out on knowing the most wonderful person in the world. And that's her loss, Michael. It's her loss. He smiled, that small, careful smile he had perfected over the years. I know, Mom. But I didn't believe him, and I don't think he believed himself. The favoritism became more obvious as the children grew older. Alina and Walter paid for Sarah and David and Emily to attend private school. Michael and Sarah attended public school, and Alina never offered to help with the costs. They established college funds for their other grandchildren. When Michael graduated high school, Alina gave him a card with $50 inside. When Sarah turned 16, Alina gave her a set of monogrammed towels. I watched my children learn to lower their expectations. I watched them stop hopping for birthday cards, stop expecting invitations to holidays, stop asking why they were always seated at the children's table even after they were grown. I watched them build walls around their hearts, and I blamed myself for not being able to tear those walls down. Daniel watched too, and Daniel, for the first time in his life, began to see. It happened gradually, the way winter turns to spring. One day he said, "My mother didn't ask about the kids' report cards." A few weeks later he said, "I noticed she only brought gifts for my sister's grandchildren at Easter." Then, one night, he came to bed and lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. "She never held Michael," he said. "Not once, not even when he was a baby." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. How did I not see that? His voice was barely a whisper. How did I not see any of it? I reached for his hand in the darkness. "Because you wanted to believe she was the mother you thought she was. There's nothing wrong with wanting to believe that." "She's my mother," his voice cracked. "She's supposed to love my children." "She should," I said, "but she doesn't know how. And that's not your fault, Daniel. It's not your fault." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know how to forgive her for this." I didn't tell him that forgiveness wasn't required. I didn't tell him that some wounds don't heal, that some relationships can't be repaired, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. He wasn't ready to hear that yet. He was still hoping his mother would change. We were both still hopping in those years. We were both still waiting for Alina to have a moment of clarity, a moment of grace, a moment where she looked at my children and saw them, truly saw them, and realized what she had been missing. That moment never came. Instead, Alina got sick. It started with forgetfulness. Little things at first, misplaced keys, forgotten appointments, a recipe she had made for 40 years that suddenly came out wrong. Then it progressed to confusion, to wandering, to the terrible, beautiful blankness that Alzheimer's carves into the faces of its victims. Walter called us on a Tuesday evening. His voice was thinner than I remembered, frailer. "The doctor says she can't live alone anymore. I can't take care of her by myself." Daniel drove to his parents' house the next morning. He spent 2 weeks sorting through their belongings, arranging for caregivers, trying to find a memory care facility that had openings. When he came home, he looked 20 years older. "She doesn't remember me," he said. "She looks at me like I'm a stranger. She asked me if I knew when her son was coming to visit." I held him while he cried. I held him the way I had held Michael when he was 7 years old, standing alone in the backyard with his half-full Easter basket. I held him and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. His mother had forgotten him. After all those years of loving her, waiting for her, hopping for her, she had forgotten him. And there was no resolution, no reconciliation, no moment of understanding. Just silence, just absence. Just the terrible, irreversible fatting, of a woman who had never quite been the mother he deserved. We visited her once at the facility. She was sitting in a common room, watching television with the sound turned off. Her hair was white now, thin and wispy, and her hands were folded in her lap like she was waiting for something. She looked up when we walked in, and her face was smooth and peaceful and utterly without recognition. "Hello," she said. "Are you here to see someone?" "I'm Daniel," my husband said. "Your son." She smiled politely. "How nice. It's always lovely when children visit their parents." Then she turned back to the television, and we ceased to exist. We didn't visit again. Daniel couldn't bear it, and I couldn't blame him. Some griefs are too heavy to carry voluntarily. Some losses are too profound to witness more than once. Alina died 3 years later. Walter called with the news, his voice flat and mechanical, reciting the details like a shopping list. The funeral was Saturday. There would be a viewing Friday evening. The family would gather at the church hall afterward. Daniel hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. Then he said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." I sat down beside him. "Whatever you feel is what you're supposed to feel." "I don't think I'm sad." His voice was puzzled, like he was trying to solve a complicated equation. "I think I stopped being sad a long time ago. I just didn't realize it until now." I took his hand. "That's okay." "Is it?" He looked at me. "She was my mother. Shouldn't I feel something?" "You feel something," I said. "You just don't know what to call it yet. Give it time." He nodded slowly. "Will you come with me to the funeral?" "Of course," I said. "Of course I'll come." I didn't know then what I would witness at that funeral. I didn't know that the woman who had never loved my children would be transformed, in death, into a saint. I didn't know that the family who had ignored us for 37 years would suddenly become a united front of grief and piety. I didn't know that I would stand in the back of a church and watch my husband's relatives weep for a woman they barely knew, while my own children sat at home, nursing wounds that had never been allowed to heal. I didn't know that the funeral would be the moment when I finally stopped pretending. The morning of Alina's funeral was gray and soft, the kind of morning that makes you want to stay in bed with a cup of tea and a good book. I stood at the closet, looking at the black dresses hanging side by side, and I felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, not anticipation. Just a vast, empty stillness like the pause between lightning and thunder. I chose a simple wool dress, the same one I had worn to my own mother's funeral 10 years earlier. It was modest, appropriate, invisible. I had spent my entire marriage trying to be invisible, and invisibility had become a habit I couldn't break. Daniel was waiting in the kitchen. He wore his father's tie. Walter had given it to him years ago, a striped silk thing that Alina had chosen. Daniel's fingers moved over the knot again and again, adjusting and readjusting, a nervous ritual I had seen 1,000 times. "You don't have to wear that," I said. "You can wear your own tie." It's what she would have wanted. His voice was automatic, hollow. "Daniel," I touched his hands, stilling them. "She's gone. She can't want anything anymore. What do you want?" He looked at me, and for a moment his face was completely open, all the grief and confusion and relief he had been carrying, visible in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his jaw. "I want to get through today," he said. "I just want to get through today and never think about any of this again." "Then we'll get through it together." I squeezed his hands. "And then we'll never think about it again." The church was fuller than I expected. Alina had been a member of this congregation for 60 years, and her social circle had been wide, if not deep. I recognized faces from holiday parties and Sunday services, people whose names I had never learned but whose presence I had grown accustomed to over the decades. They nodded at us as we walked in, their expressions appropriately solemn, their condolences appropriately vague. Walter stood near the casket, accepting handshakes and embraces with the stoic resignation of a man who had been preparing for this moment for years. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished, like a photograph left too long in the sun. When he saw Daniel, his face shifted, not into grief exactly, but into something like relief. Here was his son. Here was the person who would carry the weight he could no longer bear. "Daniel," Walter's voice cracked, "Son." "Dad," Daniel embraced him, brief and formal. "How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected." Walter's eyes moved to me, and I saw the familiar flicker of uncertainty, the momentary confusion about what to say and how to say it. "Margaret, thank you for coming." "Of course," I said. "We're family." The word hung in the air between us, awkward and ill-fitting. We were family in the technical sense, bound by marriage and children and decades of shared history. But we had never been family in the way that mattered, the way that meant belonging, acceptance, love. We were family the way distant cousins are family, connected by blood but separated by circumstance. I stepped away to find a seat in the back. I didn't belong at the front, among the grieving widow and the devoted son and the grandchildren who had been favored and cherished and loved. I belonged in the back, invisible, a witness to a grief that wasn't mine. The service began. The organ played, soft and mournful. The pastor spoke about Aliner's life, her devotion to her family, her gentle spirit and generous heart. He told stories I had never heard, stories about her volunteer work at the hospital, her famous Christmas cookies, her habit of sending handwritten thank you notes to everyone who did her even the smallest kindness. He spoke of her as if she had been a saint, a paragon of virtue, a woman whose love had touched everyone who knew her. I sat in the back row and listened, and I felt something stirring in my chest. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something older and colder, something that had been sleeping for 37 years and was finally, slowly waking up. Then Daniel's sister stood up to speak. Her name was Patricia, and she was the daughter Aliner had always wanted, graceful and deferential, and utterly devoted to her mother's approval. She stood at the podium with her hands clasped and her voice trembling, and she told the congregation about what a wonderful grandmother Aliner had been. "She was always there," Patricia said. "For every recital, every birthday, every special moment. She never missed a single one. She made each of her grandchildren feel like they were the most important person in the world." I gripped the edge of the pew. My knuckles were white. "She taught me how to be a mother." Patricia continued. "She showed me what it means to love unconditionally, to give without expecting anything in return. My children were blessed to have her in their lives. We were all blessed." The congregation murmured in agreement. I saw people nodding, smiling through their tears. I saw Walter wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. I saw Daniel's cousins embracing each other, united in their grief and gratitude. And I saw my children in my mind's eye. I saw Michael standing alone in the backyard with his Easter basket. I saw Sarah watching her grandmother coo over other grandchildren at her own birthday party. I saw both of them sitting at home today, not because they were too busy or too indifferent, but because they had finally learned that their grief was not welcome in this family. Something broke inside me. It wasn't a dramatic rupture, not the kind of break that makes a sound you can hear. It was more like a fault line shifting, a crack spreading slowly across a frozen lake. I sat perfectly still in the back row, my hands folded in my lap, my face composed and calm. But beneath the surface, everything was changing. When the service ended, we gathered in the church hall for the reception. There were sandwiches and coffee, small talk and awkward silences. I circulated through the room, accepting condolences from people who didn't know me, thanking them for coming to honor a woman I barely recognized from their descriptions. And then I heard it. "That's Daniel's wife. You know, Aliner never quite approved of her." Well, you can't blame Aliner. Daniel was her only son. No mother wants to share her baby with some outsider. "She seems nice enough, though. Quiet, keeps to herself." "Some women just don't know how to fit in with their husband's family. It's really very sad." I moved away from the voices, my face burning. I found a corner near the window, away from the crowd, and tried to breathe. The rain had started again, tapping against the glass in that same secret rhythm I had heard on the morning I left my home. Daniel found me a few minutes later. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." I wasn't fine. I was the opposite of fine. But I didn't have words for what I was feeling, and even if I had, I wouldn't have known how to say them. "It's almost over," he said. "We can leave soon." I nodded. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go home and close the door and never think about Alina or Walter or this church or this family ever again. But something kept me standing there, rooted to the spot, unable to move. That's when I saw them. Patricia's children, Alina's beloved grandchildren, were standing in a cluster near the food table. They were adults now, with careers and spouses and children of their own. They wore expensive black clothing and appropriate expressions of grief, and they were surrounded by relatives who touched their arms and murmured condolences, and remembered aloud how close they had been to their grandmother. And next to them, utterly alone, stood my son. I blinked. Michael wasn't supposed to be here. He had told me he wasn't coming, that he couldn't face another day of watching his grandmother's family pretend she had loved him. I had understood. I had supported his decision. I had told him that grief doesn't require attendance at funerals, that he could mourn or not mourn in whatever way felt right to him. But he was here. He had come anyway. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, his face carefully neutral. He was 34 years old, a grown man with a career and a wife and a child of his own. But in that moment, he looked exactly like the 7-year-old boy who had stood alone in the backyard, wondering why his grandmother didn't love him. I crossed the room. I didn't walk. I floated, disconnected from my body, propelled by something I couldn't name. "Michael, what are you doing here?" He looked at me and his eyes were tired. "I don't know. I thought maybe. I don't know what I thought." He glanced around the room. "Everyone keeps telling me how sorry they are that I lost my grandmother. They keep telling me what a wonderful woman she was." "What do you say?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I say thank you. What else can I say?" I took his hand. It was cold. "You can say whatever you need to say. You don't have to protect them anymore." "I'm not protecting them." His voice was flat. "I'm protecting myself. If I told them the truth, they wouldn't believe me. They'd think I was bitter or jealous or making it up. They'd tell me to forgive and forget, to let go of the past, to be the bigger person." He paused. "I'm tired of being the bigger person, Mom." I knew that exhaustion. I had lived with it for 37 years. "Then don't be, not today." He looked at me, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. "Do you remember what you told me when I was 12? When I asked you why Grandma didn't love us?" I nodded. I remembered everything. "You said it wasn't my fault. You said she was the one missing out." His voice was barely audible. "I didn't believe you then, but I believe you now." "Michael." "She didn't know me." He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking across the room, at Patricia's children, at the relatives who surrounded them, at the casket draped in white lilies. "She lived 37 years after I was born, and she never once tried to know me. Not once. And now everyone is standing here, acting like she was the perfect grandmother, and I'm supposed to be grateful for the scraps she threw at me." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to comfort him, how to fix this, how to make it better. I was his mother, and I had failed to protect him from this woman, and now the woman was dead and my son was standing in a church hall, surrounded by people who had no idea how deeply he had been hurt. Then, across the room, I heard Patricia's voice. "Michael," she was walking toward us, her arms outstretched, her face arranged in an expression of warm surprise. "I didn't know you were coming. How lovely to see you." Michael's grip tightened on my hand. "Patricia." "It's so good of you to be here." Patricia reached us and took Michael's free hand, pressing it between both of hers. "Mother would have been so touched that you came." I watched my son's face. I watched him absorb those words. Mother would have been so touched. And I watched him decide in the space of a heartbeat how to respond. "She would have been surprised," he said. "She usually was when I showed up to things." Patricia's smile faltered. "I'm sorry." "Never mind." Michael withdrew his hand. "It's not important." "But it is important." Patricia's voice had shifted, becoming sharper, more defensive. "This is a day to celebrate Mother's life, to remember all the wonderful things she did for this family." "Yes," Michael said, "all the wonderful things." The silence between them was heavy, charged with decades of unspoken words. I saw Patricia's children watching us from across the room. I saw Walter standing near the casket, his eyes fixed on his daughter and his grandson. I saw Daniel, frozen in mid-conversation, his face pale. "Is there something you want to say?" Patricia's smile had disappeared entirely. "Because if you have something to say about my mother, I think you should say it." Michael looked at her. He looked at the casket. He looked at me. Then he said, very quietly, "Your mother never loved me." Patricia's face went white. "That's not true." "It is true. She never loved me, and she never loved my sister. She tolerated us because we were part of the family, but she never wanted us here. And now everyone is acting like she was this wonderful, generous grandmother, and I'm supposed to pretend that I don't remember 37 years of being ignored and excluded and treated like I didn't belong." Patricia opened her mouth, but Michael wasn't finished. "I came here today because I thought maybe, at the end, I could find some peace, some closure. I thought maybe if I saw her one last time, I could forgive her for all the birthday parties she missed, and all the Christmas presents she forgot, and all the times she looked at me like I was a stranger in her house." His voice broke. "But she wasn't there. The casket was there, but she wasn't. And I don't even know if I'm mourning her death or mourning the grandmother I never had." The room had gone silent. Everyone was looking at us, at Michael, at Patricia, at the scene unfolding in the corner of the church hall. I saw confusion on some faces, shock on others, and on a few, just a few, I saw something that looked like recognition. Patricia was crying, not gentle, dignified tears, but angry, humiliated weeping. "How dare you? How dare you say these things about my mother on the day of her funeral? She was a good woman. She was a wonderful grandmother. You're just bitter because she wasn't your mother, and you never forgave her for that." "My mother," Michael said, "is standing right next to me, and she is the best mother I have ever known. She spent 37 years trying to protect me from a woman who was never going to love me, and I am done pretending that your mother was anything other than what she was." He turned away from Patricia. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of tears. "Can we go home now?" he asked. "I don't want to be here anymore." "Yes," I said, "we can go home now." We walked out of the church hall together, Michael and I, while the family of Alina stood in stunned silence behind us. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing, pale blue breaking through the clouds. I took my son's arm and we walked to the car, and I didn't look back. The drive home was quiet. Michael sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his reflection ghostly against the passing landscape. I didn't try to fill the silence. I had spent my whole life trying to fill silences, to smooth over awkward moments, to make things easier for everyone except myself. I was done with that. When we pulled into Michael's driveway, he didn't get out of the car immediately. He sat with his hand on the door handle, his head bowed, his shoulders curved forward in a posture I recognized from his childhood. It was the way he sat when he was trying not to cry. "I shouldn't have said those things," he whispered. "It was her funeral. I should have just been quiet and let them have their day." "No," I said. "You should have been quiet for 37 years. That was long enough." He looked at me. "Do you think anyone believed me?" I thought about the faces in the church hall, the confusion, the shock, the flicker of recognition on a few faces, Patricia's children, Walter's cousin, the elderly woman who had sat alone in the back row. Some of them believed you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday when they start remembering things they've tried to forget, they'll believe you. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, I reached over and took his hand. I don't think anything is supposed to make you feel better right now. I think you're supposed to feel exactly what you're feeling, and that's okay. He nodded slowly. I'm glad you were there. I'll always be there. That's what mothers do. He almost smiled. I know. That's why you're the best grandmother my daughter could ever have. My daughter, his daughter, my granddaughter. I thought about her, 6 years old with her father's serious eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. I thought about the way she curled up in my lap during thunderstorms, the way she asked me to tell stories about when I was a little girl, the way she said, I love you, Grandma, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I thought about all the moments I would have with her, birthday parties and dance recitals and quiet afternoons reading books. And I realized, with a clarity that took my breath away, that Alina had missed all of this. She had missed the chance to know my children as adults. She had missed the chance to hold her great-granddaughter, to watch her take her first steps and say her first words and learn to read. She had missed the chance to be the grandmother she could have been, the grandmother my grandchildren deserved. And that was her loss. Not mine, not Michael's, not Sarah's. Hers. I stayed at Michael's house for a few hours. His wife Jenna made tea and didn't ask questions. His daughter Lily showed me the picture she had drawn at school, a rainbow, a house, a family of stick figures holding hands. I studied it carefully, nodding each figure. There was Lily with her red crayon hair. There was Michael, tall and smiling. There was Jenna holding Lily's hand. And there was me on the other side, my stick figure arm extended to meet my granddaughters. No Alina, no Walter, no Patricia or her children or any of the other relatives who had filled the church hall. "We're your family," Lily said, pointing at the drawing. "That's you and Daddy and Mommy and me." "Yes," I said, "that's us." I drove home as the afternoon faded into evening. Daniel was waiting at the door, his face lined with worry. "I tried to call you. Where did you go?" "I took Michael home." "Michael was there," he blinked. "I didn't see him." "He was there. He left before you could find him." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Patricia is very upset. She says Michael ruined the funeral." "She says Michael told the truth. I don't know why that would ruin anything." "Margaret," his voice was strained. "It was my mother's funeral. Whatever she did or didn't do, she was still my mother. And Michael stood up in front of everyone and..." He stood in a corner and answered a question someone asked him. That's all. I set down my purse. If Patricia didn't want to hear the answer, she shouldn't have asked the question. Daniel looked at me like he didn't recognize me. I suppose, in some ways, he didn't. I had spent 37 years being quiet and agreeable and invisible. I had spent 37 years smoothing over conflicts and minimizing hurts and pretending that everything was fine. I had spent 37 years being the person everyone expected me to be. I was done with that. "Your mother hurt our children," I said. "Not once, not accidentally, not without knowing what she was doing. She hurt them deliberately and consistently for 37 years, and you let her." Daniel flinched. "That's not fair." "No, then tell me what is fair. Tell me what is fair about a grandmother who gives college funds to some grandchildren and $50 bills to others. Tell me what is fair about a grandmother who attends every recital for her daughter's children and can't be bothered to show up for her sons. Tell me what is fair about a grandmother who looks at her grandson like he's a stranger in her house and then expects him to stand at her casket and pretend he's grieving." Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't answer. There was no answer that would make any of it right. "I'm not asking you to hate her," I said. "She was your mother and you loved her, and I understand that. But I am asking you to see our children, really see them. See the wounds she left and the scars they carry and the way they still, after all these years, wonder what they did wrong." "I see them." His voice was barely audible. "I see them and I see you and I see that I failed all of you. I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to confront her. She was my mother. She was my children's grandmother, and she owed them the same love she gave to everyone else." I paused. "We don't owe her anything now, not forgiveness, not silence, not our presence at her funeral, pretending she was someone she wasn't." Daniel was crying. I hadn't seen him cry since his mother forgot who he was. "What do we do now?" "Now we go home, we eat dinner, we call Sarah and make sure she's okay." I took his hand. "And tomorrow, we start figuring out what kind of family we want to be." The next morning, I called my daughter. Sarah lived 3 states away, in a small apartment with a cat and a collection of houseplants she had somehow kept alive for 5 years. She had been the one to leave home and never look back, the one who built a life far away from the family that had never quite accepted her. She came home for Christmas and called on Mother's Day, but her visits were brief and her phone calls shorter. I understood why. She was protecting herself, the same way Michael had protected himself, the same way I had protected myself for 37 years. "Mom," her voice was cautious, the way it always was when she saw my name on her caller ID. "Is everything okay?" Everything is fine. I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "You never called just to hear my voice. What happened?" I told her. I told her about the funeral, about Patricia's speech, about Michael's words and the silence that followed. I told her about my conversation with Daniel, about the years of invisibility and the moment when I finally stopped pretending. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "I used to think it was my fault," she said finally. "I used to think there was something wrong with me, something I could fix if I just tried hard enough. I used to think that if I was prettier or smarter or more like Patricia's children, Grandma would finally love me. There was never anything wrong with you. You were perfect. You always were. I know that now, but it took a long time to figure it out." Her voice was soft. "I used to have this dream. I would be at a family gathering and Grandma would walk past all the other grandchildren and come straight to me. She would take my face in her hands and say, 'Sarah, I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. You are my granddaughter and I love you.' And then she would hold me, and everything would be okay." I closed my eyes. I could see it, my daughter, standing alone in the backyard, waiting for a love that was never going to come. "That dream stopped happening after a while," Sarah said. "I think I finally realized that even if she apologized, even if she said all the words I wanted to hear, it wouldn't change anything. The childhood I wanted was already over. The grandmother I deserved never existed. She should have loved you. She should have loved both of you the way I loved you. The way your father loved you, even if he didn't know how to show it." "I know," Sarah's voice was steady. "And I've made peace with it. Not because she deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. Carrying all that anger was like drinking poison and expecting her to die." I thought about that, about the poison I had been drinking for 37 years, the anger I had swallowed and suppressed and pretended didn't exist. I thought about the way it had curdled in my stomach, the way it had seeped into my bones, the way it had colored every interaction with my husband's family. I thought about the relief I had felt, standing in the church hall, watching Michael speak the words I had never been brave enough to say. "I'm proud of you," I said, "for making peace with it, for building a life away from all of this." "I'm proud of you too," Sarah said, "for finally speaking up, for finally letting yourself be angry." "I was always angry. I just didn't know how to show it." "You showed it by loving us, by being the mother Grandma never was, by breaking the cycle." She paused. "Lily will never know what it feels like to be invisible. Michael and Jenna will never let her feel that way. And that's because of you." I didn't know what to say. I had spent so many years focused on what I hadn't been able to give my children, protection from their grandmother's cruelty, a family that accepted them unconditionally, the childhood they deserved, that I had never stopped to consider what I had given them. I had given them myself. I had given them my presence, my attention, my unwavering belief in their worth. I had given them the love that Alina had withheld, and that love had sustained them, nourished them, helped them grow into adults who could speak the truth even when it was painful. "I love you," I said. "I love you, and I am so proud of the woman you've become." "I love you too, Mom." Her voice was thick. "I always have, even when I couldn't say it." We talked for a few more minutes about her job and her cat and her plans to visit for the holidays. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room and watched the afternoon light shift across the floor. The house was peaceful. No Alina, no Walter, no Patricia, just me and the memories I had chosen to keep. Walter died 6 months after Alina. It was quick, or so they said. A heart attack, sudden and massive, no time for goodbyes. Daniel got the call at work and drove home with the same hollow expression he had worn since his mother's funeral. I held him while he cried, and I didn't say any of the things I was thinking. I didn't say that Walter had been complicit in Alina's cruelty, that his silence had been its own kind of weapon, that he had stood by for 40 years and watched his wife hurt our children and never once intervened. I didn't say any of that, because Daniel was grieving and grief deserves compassion, not accounting. But I didn't go to the funeral. Daniel understood, or maybe he didn't understand, but he accepted it, which was enough. He went alone, and when he came back, he didn't talk about what had been said or who had been there. He just put his keys in the bowl by the door and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "It's over." Yes, I thought, it's over. The months passed. Patricia stopped speaking to us, which was more relief than loss. Daniel's relationship with his father's side of the family became polite and distant, the kind of connection maintained through Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. Michael and Sarah continued to build their lives, far away from the family that had never accepted them, and I continued to be the grandmother I had always wanted to be. Lily grew. She lost her first tooth, learned to ride a bicycle, started kindergarten. She called me every Sunday evening, her small voice earnest and serious as she described the important events of her week, a new friend at school, a picture she had drawn, a book she had read with Daddy. I listened to every word and stored them away in my heart, the way I had stored away Michael's first words and Sarah's first steps. These were the moments that mattered. These were the memories I would carry with me. One Sunday, Lily said, "Grandma, did you have a grandma when you were a little girl?" I thought about my own grandmother, a soft woman with flour-dusted hands and a laugh like wind chimes. She had died when I was 12, but I still remembered the way she smelled, lavender and vanilla, and something warm from the oven. I remembered sitting at her kitchen table, learning to roll pie dough, listening to her stories about growing up on a farm with 7 brothers and sisters. "Yes," I said. "I had a grandmother. She was very kind." "Was she like you?" I smiled. "I hope so." "Because you're the best grandma." Lily's voice was certain, absolute. "Daddy says you're the best grandma in the whole world." I closed my eyes. I thought about Michael, standing alone in the backyard with his Easter basket. I thought about Sarah, waiting for an apology that never came. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to protect them from a woman who was never going to love them. And I thought about Alina, lying in her casket with white lilies draped across the polished wood, her family gathered around her, speaking words of love and loss and gratitude. I thought about the grandchildren who had stood at her bedside and held her hand and told her they would miss her. I thought about my children, sitting at home, nursing wounds that had never been allowed to heal. "She was my children's grandmother," I said, "but she wasn't very kind to them, and that made me very sad." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sometimes people aren't kind to the people they should be kind to. That's what Daddy says." "Yes," I said, "that's exactly right." "But you're kind to me." Her voice was small but certain. "And I'm kind to you, and that's what matters." I thought about the funeral. I thought about the perfect grandparents standing at the casket and weeping. I thought about the stories they told, the memories they shared, the saint they had constructed from a woman who had never been a saint. I thought about the truth, buried under years of silence and complicity and denial. And I thought about my granddaughter, 6 years old, holding the telephone with both hands and telling me that kindness matters. "Yes," I said, "that's what matters." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my living room and watched the evening light fade from the windows. The house was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of Daniel reading in his study and the clock ticking on the mantel and the distant hum of traffic from the street below. I thought about Alina. I thought about Walter. I thought about all the years I had spent trying to earn their approval, their acceptance, their love. I didn't think about them very often anymore. The anger had faded, not because I had forgiven them, but because I had finally stopped needing anything from them. They couldn't hurt me anymore. They couldn't hurt my children anymore. They were gone, and the world continued without them, and my grandchildren would grow up never knowing the weight of their conditional love. That was the gift I had given my family. Not forgiveness. I still wasn't sure I believed in forgiveness, not for the kind of cruelty Alina had practiced, but freedom. Freedom from the endless cycle of hopping and waiting and being disappointed. Freedom from the need to earn love from people who didn't know how to give it. Freedom from the poison of swallowed anger and unspoken truths. I didn't know, standing in the back of that church, whether Michael's words had changed anything. I didn't know whether the family had hurt him, whether they would ever acknowledge the truth he had spoken. I didn't know whether Patricia would ever understand what her mother had done, or whether Walter had died still believing his wife was a saint. But I knew that my son had spoken his truth. I knew that my daughter had found peace. I knew that my granddaughter would never know what it felt like to be invisible because her father had learned from my pain and his own, and he would never let her feel that way. And I knew that I had finally, after 37 years, stopped pretending. The perfect grandparents acted their part at the funeral. They stood at the casket and wept. They held each other and whispered about how much they would miss her. They told stories about her kindness, her generosity, her gentle hands. And I stood in the back, invisible, remembering the truth. The truth is not a weapon. It is not a punishment or a revenge or a score to be settled. The truth is simply what happened. The truth is the grandmother who never loved my children. The truth is the funeral where everyone pretended otherwise. The truth is my son, standing alone in a crowded room, finally saying the words he had carried for 37 years. The truth is that some wounds never fully heal, but some wounds, once spoken aloud, begin to close. I am 73 years old. I have lived long enough to know that memory is water, shifting and flowing and changing shape. I have lived long enough to know that the photographs on the wall are not the whole story, that the spaces between them matter just as much. I have lived long enough to know that love can live inside floorboards and porch swings and the crack in the driveway where the children used to ride their bicycles. But love can also live in the voices of grandchildren, calling on Sunday evenings to say, "You're the best grandma in the whole world." Alina never knew that love. She never heard her grandchildren's voices, not really. She never saw them clearly, never understood who they were and who they might become. She spent her whole life measuring and weighing and finding them lacking, and she died without ever realizing that the lack was in herself. I think about that sometimes. Not with satisfaction, I am not that petty. Not with sadness, I grieved for Alina long before she died. But with a kind of quiet wonder, the way you might think about a narrow escape or a close call. I almost became her. I almost spent my whole life measuring and weighing and finding people lacking. I almost let the poison of swallowed anger and unspoken truth seep into my bones and make me bitter. But I had my children. I had my son standing in the backyard with his Easter basket. I had my daughter waiting for an apology that never came. I had my grandchildren calling on Sunday evenings to tell me about their weeks. And they saved me the way children have always saved their parents, not by fixing us, not by forgiving us, but simply by being themselves, by loving us, by giving us a reason to be better than we were. So this is what I want you to know, whoever you are, wherever you are in your own story. If you are standing in the back of a church, invisible, watching people pretend to be the grandparents you wish they had been, I see you. I know how much it hurts. I know how long the wounds take to heal, and how some of them never fully close. If you are sitting alone in your room, wondering what you did wrong, why your grandmother looks through you like a stranger in her house, it is not your fault. It was never your fault. The lack is in her, not in you. If you are carrying the poison of swallowed anger, the weight of unspoken truth, you don't have to carry it forever. You don't have to forgive. You don't have to forget. But you do have to speak. You have to say the words even if no one believes you. You have to tell the truth even if the truth doesn't change anything. You have to let the poison out or it will consume you from the inside. And if you are a grandmother or a mother or anyone who has the power to break a cycle of conditional love and invisible children, break it. Break it with your presence, your attention, your unwavering belief in the worth of every child who crosses your path. Break it with Sunday evening phone calls and homemade birthday cards and the simple, radical act of showing up. Break it with the words, "I love you," and the words, "It's not your fault," and the words, "You are enough exactly as you are." The perfect grandparents stood at the casket and wept. They told stories about a woman who never existed, a grandmother who never loved my children. But my grandchildren will tell different stories. They will tell stories about the grandmother who was always there, who never missed a birthday or a recital or a quiet afternoon reading books. They will tell stories about the grandmother who held them during thunderstorms and taught them to roll pie dough and listened to their small, earnest voices on Sunday evenings. They will tell stories about the grandmother who looked at them and saw exactly who they were, not who she wished they were, not who she expected them to be, but exactly who they were, and loved them anyway. And that is the only legacy that matters. That is the only truth worth telling.